Do any of you ever feel like it's sort of hard to be a Christian? Like Jesus has these expectations that are so big. We're supposed to change the world, to build a new kingdom, but not with any of the tools that are useful in the kingdoms and the empires in which we live. But Jesus still asks us to do this work. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is sending his disciples out into the world without a bag, without extra sandals or robes, saying to them, "Go with what I have given you, this message of love for the world, and it will be enough. Trust that people will welcome you in. Trust that you will know what to say. Trust that you will be able to heal and bind up the broken. Trust me and go." Jesus does the same with us, sends us out into the world so that we can be bearers of this gospel message. So it's interesting how often we talk about hospitality as us being the ones who offer it. In Bible study this week, we talked about what we learned as children about what does it mean to welcome somebody into your home. For one of the families, it meant that their mother had a beautiful white apron always ready for when the preacher might come to call. Or for some people, welcoming someone into their home looks like make yourself at home, get yourself whatever you'd like to drink, have at anything in our home that you would like to do, sit, play. Sometimes being welcome into a home is being invited to chop the carrots for Sunday's dinner, or to have a lovely tea setting with the best linen and all our best china out as a sign of how well we think of you and how we want to give you our best. But if we think about it, at the heart of welcome is not any of those outward manifestations, but is an openness in us to someone else. Because when we welcome someone, whether it's into our church building, into our homes, into a conversation, we put them at the center, which means that we move from the center of our thinking so that this other person can take that place. When Paul writes to the church in Rome, he writes about the way that sin and its tyranny over our lives shapes how we are and how we encounter the world. He talks about how sin makes it all about us. I am concerned about what I want and about what I need, and that is what I focus on in my life. I try to figure out how to get what's best for me. But Paul talks to the church and he says, but how much did that really get you? Because as far as he could tell, and as far as I can tell too, when we continue to focus only on ourselves, it doesn't seem like we get nearly as far as we might. But then Paul begins to teach about freedom in God. What does it look like when we open ourselves to God and to this relationship with Jesus that changes us? When we do that, we open ourselves not only to God, but to other people. It's as if by opening, we are open to everything, not just God. But by opening, we are also able to see before us people who we probably would have overlooked before. And so Paul talks to the church in Rome about what it looks like and why it is that as Christians, as disciples of Jesus, we seek to be open to the other. Because this freedom in God already asks us to put the other first, to be open to who they are and to what they have to share with the world. And he says to them that the church, that we find that when we are open to each other, the needs that were so important for ourselves are actually met. without us having to focus on ourselves much at all. It just is sort of counterintuitive. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense that if we don't look out for ourselves, we will be taken care of. And if we do look out for ourselves, we lose so much of the wonder and beauty and joy of life. How does this make any sense? I was thinking about these scriptures and I remembered a book I read many years ago called An Altar in the World by Barbara Brown Taylor. She's a theologian and a teacher and a wonderful preacher. And she wrote this book about how we can encounter God in the most ordinary ways. And each chapter, she sort of explores different ways that we can practice faith by walking, by encountering others. We can practice faith by recognizing that God's presence isn't only presence in holy rooms like the sanctuary where I am standing, or in holy moments of dedicated prayer, but that God is present everywhere. And for Christians, and for all people of faith, we are called to pay attention, to see God's presence, to recognize it. And the more we seek after God, the more we get to know God, the more easily we recognize God's presence in the world. In the chapter that she wrote about encountering others, she talks a lot about how in the 4th century, the desert fathers and mothers were mystics, were Christians who left the cities, who left kind of the busy communities of faith so that they could focus on God. But even as they lived their separate lives in their separate caves, they had community with one another. Not because they were many, but because when they engaged with one another and encountered one another, they were open. They were welcoming to one another, not just to bring people in, but to learn from one another about what God was up to. And I wonder if in these days, this isn't a really important invitation for us to pay attention to. In a world that tells us to pay attention to what we need, to what is most important about what we believe should happen or not happen, this message of encounter, this invitation to welcome, has power to bring together so many of us who are divided by opinions and beliefs, by rhetoric that seeks to divide us. It is a powerful tool that is used and enabled by sin that pulls people apart along lines of difference. Many of you are much wiser than I am and have shown me throughout my time here what it looks like to be able to know and to love people with whom you don't always agree. To know that there is something more important that binds us together, connects us not only to one another, but to the world around us. It is those connections, it is that love that God has, not just for us, but for the other, that I think will help us to witness to the world this different way of being, this freedom that we celebrate as Christians, this hope we have for a world that is not broken and disintegrated, but that is brought together and repaired. In the book, An Altar in the World, she also is very mindful that when we encounter the other, part of the invitation is to see the image of God in the other person. And that practice may be nowhere more profound than when we seek to see the image of God in a person whom we feel is most different from us. If we are able to acknowledge that God's image is embodied in us in all the ways that we know we do not deserve that image, at least I don't, then it is important for us to practice seeing the image of God in others. Because when we can see in each other how God has imprinted upon us, there is more and more opportunity to grow in an understanding of who we are and of where we belong and how we can do these things together. When Paul wrote to the church in Rome, he was very interested in helping that church and those people understand the freedom to follow Jesus is not about just letting all of it go, but is about how we are enabled to dive deep into relationship and community. How we are able to let go of the fear of difference in favor of the love and connection of community. Each of us has a different part to play in this hospitality, in this openness to the other in our lives. Maybe for some of us, there's a relationship that we are able to develop, to dig in. Maybe there's someone who has been on the periphery of our life that we'd like to get to know better. Maybe for some of us, it's just a reminder that every time we hear a story about people that are different from us, that we pause to remember they are made in the image of God too, before we respond without thinking. Maybe for some of us, it is thinking about how do we invite people into our gardens because our homes are not options. Maybe it's a thought about how do we open ourselves to learning from people who are different from us. There are so many ways that Jesus invites us to see the other person and to put them at the center, because we have so much to learn about how God is at work in each other. And in that learning, we can build a community. There's so much beauty in our world. It is a shame when all we see is the division. And I wonder today if it isn't about trusting in Jesus, just like those first disciples had to trust that when they left Jesus' side, they would find welcome in homes. They would be heard as teachers, and they would be sought out as healers. But the only way they would ever find out would be to get on the road and start the journey. We cannot go with Jesus if we are not willing to take the steps in front of us. It is my prayer and my hope that each of us, in our own way, will accept the invitation to be open to God and to see before us the opportunity to become a community together that can bring the change that is desperately needed, the freedom of God's love for the whole world, to manifestation and fruition through the Spirit of God who enables all things and who loves us into being. Amen. Now we enter into a time of prayer together. I'm just going to check the list real quick to make sure I didn't miss any new prayer